Hello and welcome to this new tutorial video from Boxalino. My name is Sylvain Paillard, I'm the CTO and co-founder of Boxalino, and in this video we are going to go through the first part of the tutorials on narratives. Before watching this video, we recommend to at least watch the introduction tutorial to the Boxalino Winning Interactions admin. There is another series of 3 videos which speaks about the topic of widgets. You can watch the videos on the narrative before, but we recommend to watch the 3 videos about the widgets before watching the videos about the narratives, because in these videos we are referring to widgets without going into the details of how they are defined. This first part video focuses on the fixed and conditional layouts of the narrative, their contexts and how to make them conditional with these contexts, the layout blocks and their parameters in a static way. So we're going to go in the narrative, which is in the marketing menu under narrative. And here we have a table view which is showing us the lists of the narratives that have been defined in this account. Before looking at the advanced case, we will simply start by adding a new narrative. So here I can simply add a test narrative and save it, and it appears now at the end of the table. The narrative are always added at the end of the table. So if you have several, if you have more than 10 results, you might not see it and you need to go to the last page or to increase the page size. So that's just in case. Now, when I'm editing this test narrative, then I have here the main options. And the first thing is that I can select one or several widgets to be connected to my narrative. So let's just look at the flow of how the narrative works to understand how they are connected to the widget. So what we can see here is that the request from your front end goes to our API, and this selects a narrative and a widget. But in fact, what happens is that the request that you're sending always is about a widget. So the widget is known, and it's actually the narrative which is selected based on the widget that you're requesting. And that's pretty logical, because you can have different narratives, for instance, for a category page, but you have one widget which will show you the product listing in a category page. And therefore, as an integrator, you simply say, well, give me the narrative for the widget category or navigation or whatever name it has. And then the system will say, oh, okay, based on this widget, what layout should I take, and selects one of the narratives to select it. So that's actually the reasoning. So back in our environment here, I can select one or several widgets. Typically, I will select one widget. So for instance, here I can select a brand widget, but I could select more than a widget. This would only make sense if you would want to use the same narrative for different widgets and don't want to copy this narrative because it is the same. It can happen, but it's a quite untypical case. So the normal rule is to say that a narrative has one widget. The opposite is not necessarily true. You can definitely have several narratives connected to the same widget. And then the system has to decide which of the narrative will be selected for the widget. So what the system will do is that it will go into the context of the narrative, and there we have the possibility to specify a context. This is not specific to the narrative. You will find the context possibilities in many different views of Boxalino. It's a general concept, but it's very much used in the narratives. And here I can then say, well, this narrative yes, it applies for this widget, but not always. It only applies for this widget when this condition is reached. And here you can have a condition on the search query, on the context items, on the variants, on the context parameters, on the filters, on the choice ID, on the journey step, on the language, on the excluded use case ID, on the segmentation key, and on the script condition. The very typical ones to use will be variant, because that's the way to do an A/B test. You can say, well, I create two narratives, and one of them I will connect it to a test variant that I will call basically test A. And now the simple fact that I am doing this will create an A/B test. So that means that now I will have 50% of my visitors who, if they go into the widget brand, they will go in this narrative, and the other 50% would go in another narrative that doesn't have this context. So that's the idea, but there are many others that can be done, and they can be combined, and they combine with an AND logic. So I can say it's only in test A, and it only applies, for instance, in the case of the filter on the category, for instance, beauté maquillage. So this one here. So that's basically you can combine these contexts to create more complicated logics. But typically you have only one. It can be on the variant. It can be on the filter. So on the filter, that would mean you are on a category page, on a search page for a specific type of search, on context item, meaning on specific type of product detail page, or on a specific situation of a basket page, for a specific language, and so on and so forth. We will not go in depth of all of the context possibilities, because that's not specific to the narrative, but it's important to understand that they are very flexible and that you can use them to do conditions in the narrative quite as you want. So I will remove it. So now again, this narrative will apply all the time. And in case there are more than one narrative that would be considered as valid in a specific situation, then the one with the most specific context will be selected. So if I have a narrative that is always valid, like with no context, and another narrative which is, only for the people in this category, then of course the people, when they come in this category, they will have two narratives which is valid, the global one and the specific one to the category, and then the specific one will be the one considered. So you don't have to exclude on the other side. If there are several narratives that are valid, then we will select the one which is the most specific based on its context. Okay, so now we get to the other parameters here. We have the title, we have aliases, and here we have this SEO content where we can define a page title, a breadcrumb, a meta tag, and other parameters. So the fact that you will need to set these options or not completely depends on how you have integrated the narrative into your website. If you have integrated the narrative in the website so that the entire title of the narrative is based on the configuration of the narrative, then you have to provide them, because this is what your website will rely for that page to display on that page. But if you only use the narrative as a visual zone, for instance in the home page, that's the typical case we will see after, then you don't need to set them, simply because you're not actually using this information. You're setting this information by yourself in your website, and you only need the narrative to actually deliver the content of one or several zones of your page. But they are not very hard to understand, so the question is more for your integrator: in which situation do you need to specify them, and in which situation they will be ignored. But now we get to the actual real center of what the narrative is. And the narrative is a layout. So it's a configured layout for a certain page. So if we go, for instance, to the list here, we have, it's either a fixed layout, a conditional layout, or a reference. We will not really check the reference. Now the reference is just a way that if you don't want to copy layouts that are always the same many places, you can create it once, and then you can basically import it in the narrative here without having to redefine it. But this is a not very frequent usage. Normally you just define the layout in the narrative and you can say it's either a fixed layout or a conditional layout. So a fixed layout basically looks something like this. You have a section layout blocks and you have a section context. So this context here is exactly the same logic as the context here. It's the same set of possibilities. But here they are specific to that fixed layout. So that means that I can create 3 fixed layouts and connect them to different contexts, and then the ones which are in the right context will apply. So whether you want to use the context in your layout or in the entire narrative is completely up to you. Technically both are fully supported. In some situations it's easier to have several narratives that are completely separated. In others it's easier to define different layouts which are connected to different contexts. Now let's say that I don't define any context, so that's actually mean, well, that will be my fixed layout for all situations. And now we have a drop down here where we can define a block. So when I open here, I have a list of layout blocks that appear. This list is 100% based on what your integrators have created. So this list will be empty. So it's not because you see here facets or pagination that you will have the same values. So make sure that you have an exchange with your integrators so that when they prepare new layout blocks for you, then you know what they mean and you know what type of template is behind. But here, for instance, if I select a layout block here, the CMS block, and I add it, then it will add it to this list. And the fixed layout itself, so we have a list of fixed layouts, but the fixed layout itself is a list of layout blocks that are configured. So I can add several times the same one, or I can add different ones. I can reorder them. So that's basically the list. You can have different position in your narrative. So maybe you have a zone at the top, a zone at the bottom with a separation. Here you will not see this separation. This is done by parameters. So if we open this CMS block here, we will see all of the parameters that this CMS blog has. So here we can see there's an image link, there's a headline, there's a headline color, information, intro color, and so on. So these parameters are simply the parameters that the integrators have configured for that specific layout blocks. So more or less, these are the parameters of the template, and if we provide all of the values to these parameters, then the template will render in an appropriated way. And you might have here, that depends the way the integration has been done, but you might have here a parameter position. And if you have one, then you can simply say this is for the position top, this is for the position bottom, and then you can this way separate it. But in the view here, we will see all of the different layout blocks of the same narrative, just one after the other. The separation in the position is done independently, so we'll always have one list. Now here I can simply type the information that I want here. So I can say here this is my headline. I can type all of these aspects and enter the information here in the content. We will see after, not in depth though, but we'll see after that we can directly enter content like this, but we can also enter dynamic variables. And this is actually one of the key difference that you can do in the narrative. You can create completely static narratives, meaning use it a little bit like a CMS, saying, okay, well, I have a new landing page. I will enter all of the content for my blocks here. But you might also say, no, I want to have a very dynamic narrative. and it will provide the content here from different sources, maybe a campaign, maybe external headless CMS, and so on and so forth. So this is basically one of the key differences in the narrative, whether you enter directly the static contents here and then it is what it is, it's what is displayed, or whether you actually define variables. And this is also what makes a huge difference in the complexity of using the narrative. More or less everyone can be trained to use the narrative to enter static content. It's not really difficult. But to use variables, that requires a quite different set of skill, and this is typically not done in that case then by the typical marketing user, but more by a trained optimizer of these so-called Boxalino hero, as we refer to it in our documentation, to be able to do that. But the concept is pretty simple. We just select these layout blocks and we just type the content in the form, and that's it. And so that's for the fixed layout blocks, and we have otherwise the conditional layouts. And here I can create a conditional layout, and in the conditional layout I have a context. So very similar idea. I have a context, but not a context like here, which is for the entire fixed layout. I have a context to define. So here I really must define a context. Maybe it can be, again, this test variant, test A. And now, in the conditional layout, I can create, again, fixed layout, conditional layout, and reference. So it's a nested structure. And now I can create 2 fixed layout or 3. And you can see here I have these true or false options. So I can do something like this, for instance. The first one will be used only if the context is true. The second one will be used for both cases, and the third one will only be used if the context is false. So this is basically another way to create dynamism in your layout. So at the end of the day, you could do it probably with fixed layouts, and you can do it with conditional layouts, but it's a little bit sometimes easier to configure it like this than with several layouts, and then for each one we have to look in the context to know. But what's convenient is that here you can see the system shows you what the context is. So then if you reopen it, you can say, oh yeah, that's a conditional layout on the variant test A. So you don't have to expand it to basically see what is your context. But then inside the fixed layout, it's exactly the same. It has again a context in addition. So more or less, there's no combination of conditional logic that you can't do with all of these options. And then you can again enter different layout blocks here and configure them. So that's basically the key ID and all of the different options that we have here in the narrative. Now what we're going to do is that we are going to look at a concrete case of a narrative, which is from our demo shop. So here I will go to the home page of the demo shop. And here we can see that we have here these banners. Then we have these recommendations, personalized recommendations. Then we have this marking in trend. Then we have these top categories, these best sellers, this in sale, and these different blog suggestions. And so here, this entire layout is done with a narrative. So we're going to look at how it is done more concretely. So here I will go to the home widget in its narrative here, and I will see that I have this layout. So in this case, we have not used any conditional layout, we have not used any context, we just defined that's the layout of the home page. And here you can see exactly the same block, so it's really one-to-one what we see: the promoted campaigns, the product slider, the top brands, the top categories, the product slider for the bestseller, for the discounts, and finally the recommendations of the blogs. So I could reorder them. I could say this block only appears for for this type of cases. I could do different things to be able to conditionalize them, make them different in different cases, as we have seen before. But what we're going to focus on now is to look at how it was configured. So I will start here with these top categories. So to be clear, this is this part here in the middle. So these top categories which have been configured, and here I will extend it, and here we can see that we have the title that has been defined, we have an order which has been set, we have an accessor which is empty. I will speak about the accessor later, and then we have sub-content. So that's something we have not viewed before, but the idea is that some of the layout blocks can have sub-content. So they're containers of other layout blocks. So it's a nested structure. And so here in the sub-content, I have, again, a list of layouts. So the sub-content is like the fixed layout, just inside these specific layout blocks. And here I have a first category item, second category item, third category item, and fourth category item. And in this case, we want purely static. That's why it's what I'm starting with here to explain. So that means that all of the parameters here, the picture, the color, the headline, all of these things, the URL, all of these things have been defined specifically. So that means that anyone can change it, just replace the URLs, the labels, the colors with something else, save it, and it will work. So there, nothing special to use the Boxalino narrative. It's just that we support more or less like any good CMS with a template system behind. We support these possibilities to do it like that here.